The last of the branded, if you will, low carbohydrate approaches we're talking about today is called the Slow Carb Diet. And this is a plan proposed by Tim Ferriss in his book, The 4-Hour Body, though he has no nutrition background or credentials, just to point that out. I mention it here because it was on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's been featured on popular podcasts like his own podcast, The Tim Ferriss Show, and the Huberman Lab podcast. Since it is considered low carbohydrate based on the foods it restricts, I wanted to mention it, but I'm not as familiar with it as I am with some of these more established ones that we've covered. The slow carb diet has some basic rules. 1, avoid white and starchy carbohydrates. This will be your simple carbohydrates like sugar, as well as bread, pasta, rice, potatoes. Even if they're whole grain, you're avoiding it. 2, eat the same meals over and over again, and those are going to be composed of a vegetable, beans or lentils, and a protein. 3, don't drink calories. So basically, no fruit juice, milk, caloric soda, etc., although there is an exception for red wine, which I find somewhat interesting. 4 is don't eat fruit at least 6 days per week. And 5, take 1 day off per week to eat whatever you want. Now, that last one might sound fun, but there's a few potential issues with a cheat day. 1, it can really promote binge-like eating, which may be fine for some people, but this is not a good idea for anyone with a tendency to binge eat, eating a lot of food in a short window. I mean, the very definition of binge eating disorder, which is the most common eating disorder in the US, is that binge eating episodes typically occur at least once a week for 3 months. So if you go crazy on this cheat day once a week for several months, you now meet the definition of an eating disorder. If you believe you could follow this approach and simply enjoy a few extra foods in moderation that you can't eat during the week, then something like this might work for you. But that's my main beef with this one. The other consideration is that eating well throughout the entire week and then eating whatever you want in whatever portions you want for 1 day can really wreak havoc on your digestive system. We talked in episode 3 on fasting about how your circadian rhythms adjust to your eating schedule. Your system is also adjusted to the types of foods you consume and how much of them you consume. So you could have some very unpleasant side effects with this binging approach 1 day a week. That said, this approach is not like some of the others where you're counting carbohydrates or aiming for a certain macronutrient distribution. It's low carbohydrate simply based on what all it cuts out, which are simple sugars and even most complex carbohydrates like fruit and grains, even whole grains. You're left with protein, vegetables, and beans or lentils to eat. So you are getting carbohydrates from the beans and lentils and perhaps a little from the vegetables, but it's still a pretty low carbohydrate approach. I'm not aware of any scientific studies that have been done using this approach, so it's basically an influencer diet with no scientific backing or safety data. It would not be at the top of my list as a recommendation, but reducing simple carbohydrates, focusing on adding beans and lentils to your meals, lean protein and vegetables, it's not the worst advice, which leads me to my final point about all of these low carbohydrate approaches. We're about to get into the various health benefits of lower carbohydrate diets, and there do seem to be many reasons why reducing carbohydrates, particularly those simple carbohydrates that don't come with additional nutrients and fiber, are going to be beneficial for you. Do you gain true long-term benefit from doing a short-term, highly restrictive jump start like we see in the Atkins or South Beach diet? It doesn't seem so. Do you gain true benefits from buying the packaged foods and snacks these companies want to sell you? I'd say the opposite is true. The more you can avoid processed packaged foods, even if they're Zone or Atkins or South Beach approved, the better. Instead, taking the general principles from the Zone diet of higher protein, healthy fats, and a slight reduction in carbohydrates, focusing on getting your carbs from complex carbohydrates, which we also see in the maintenance phase of Atkins and South Beach, is going to be a better general approach, and it saves you the pain of having to stick with an incredibly restrictive diet for several weeks or months when the results at 6 months to a year out are going to be pretty similar if you simply follow a more moderate approach.